the first thing Rowan noticed wasn't the tears. It was the way Alara stood at the edge of the crowded hospital courtyard in the bright afternoon sun, surrounded by dozens of people yet looking more alone than anyone he had ever seen. Her hands trembled as she clutched a folded envelope against her chest, her face pale with exhaustion, and when she looked up, there was a silent desperation in her eyes that made the noise of the entire world disappear. She took a slow breath before quietly saying the words that would change 2 lives forever. She didn't want to be alone tonight. Rowan had been walking toward the parking lot after visiting his recovering father, determined to leave behind another exhausting day, but something deep inside him refused to let him keep walking. Sometimes a single sentence from a stranger carries more weight than a lifetime of ordinary conversations, and before he realized it, he had turned around. If stories about kindness, hope, and second chances mean something to you, we hope you'll continue this journey with us. Rowan had spent years convincing himself that getting involved in other people's problems only led to heartbreak. 5 years earlier, he had lost his wife during a difficult illness, and ever since then he had buried himself in work as a furniture craftsman in a quiet coastal town. His neighbors respected him, but very few truly knew him anymore. Every afternoon followed the same routine. He visited his father at the rehabilitation center, stopped for groceries, returned home, and worked in silence until sunset. It was a life built to avoid emotional risks. Yet the young woman standing before him seemed to challenge every wall he had carefully built around his heart. Alara wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for favors. She simply looked like someone who had reached the edge of her strength. The envelope she held contained medical papers explaining that her grandmother, the only family member who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident, had only a short time left to live. The doctors had arranged home care, but there was still paperwork, medications, and endless responsibilities waiting for someone already overwhelmed. Friends had slowly disappeared when life became difficult. Neighbors offered polite sympathy before returning to their own busy lives. She had spent the entire morning smiling through conversations with nurses, pretending she was stronger than she felt, until the weight of pretending became impossible to carry. Rowan gently offered to help carry her grocery bags that had been sitting beside a bench. She hesitated at first because life had taught her not to trust strangers, but there was a quiet honesty in his eyes that reminded her of the grandfather she barely remembered. They walked together beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, speaking only when necessary. The silence between them didn't feel awkward. It felt peaceful. For the first time in weeks, Alara felt as though someone saw her pain without demanding an explanation. When they reached the modest little house where she lived with her grandmother, Rowan noticed how carefully everything had been maintained despite obvious financial struggles. Flowers bloomed beside the front steps, the windows were spotless, and an old wooden swing rested beneath a maple tree. The place carried the warmth of people who valued love more than possessions. Inside, her grandmother greeted him with surprising energy, thanking him repeatedly before insisting he stay for coffee. Rowan almost refused, but something about the old woman's bright smile reminded him of afternoons he had once shared with his own late wife. As the afternoon stretched on, Rowan quietly repaired a broken kitchen cabinet that had been hanging crooked for months. He fixed a loose porch railing and adjusted the squeaky front gate without anyone asking him to. Alara watched from the doorway, unable to remember the last time someone had helped simply because they cared. Every act of kindness she had received lately seemed to come with expectations attached. Rowan expected nothing. That simple truth slowly began rebuilding something inside her that she thought had disappeared forever. Before leaving, Rowan promised only one thing. If she ever needed practical help during the coming days, she could call him. He carefully wrote his number on the back of a receipt and placed it beside the medicine bottles on the kitchen counter. He didn't make dramatic promises or claim everything would somehow be all right. Instead, he offered something far more valuable: reliability. As he drove home through the golden afternoon light, Rowan couldn't stop thinking about the sadness hidden behind Alara's gentle smile. He realized that helping her had stirred emotions he had buried for years. For the first time since losing his wife, his house no longer felt like a peaceful refuge. It felt painfully empty. What Rowan didn't yet know was that this unexpected meeting outside the hospital wasn't simply about helping a stranger through one difficult day. It was the beginning of a journey that would force both of them to confront old grief, rediscover forgotten hope, and learn that sometimes the people who arrive unexpectedly are the very ones who help us find our way back to life. The following afternoon, Rowan found himself thinking about the little house far more often than he expected. Every piece of wood he sanded in his workshop reminded him of the broken cabinet he had repaired, and every quiet moment brought back the image of Alara trying so hard to stay strong while carrying more than anyone should have to bear. He finally accepted that some encounters are impossible to ignore, so after closing his workshop early, he stopped by a local bakery and picked up fresh bread before driving to her home. He told himself it was simply a friendly visit, yet deep inside he knew he was searching for something he had been missing for years, a reason to care about someone again. When he arrived, he found Alara sitting on the porch steps with a notebook in her lap. She had spent the morning making lists of expenses, medication schedules, and appointments, but the numbers refused to add up. Her grandmother needed more care than she could afford, and she had quietly started looking for a second job despite already working full-time at the town library. The exhaustion on her face was impossible to hide. Even so, she greeted Rowan with a genuine smile, one that seemed brighter than the afternoon sunshine. For the first time in many weeks, she felt that someone had returned because they wanted to, not because they felt obligated. Over the next several days, Rowan became a familiar presence around the little house. He repaired a leaking fence, replaced loose porch boards, and built a small bookshelf for Alara's grandmother so her favorite novels could be kept within easy reach. He never accepted payment. Seeing the relief on their faces was enough. In return, Alara insisted on preparing simple lunches whenever he visited, and those quiet meals slowly replaced awkward silence with easy conversation. They discovered they both loved old coastal towns, rainy afternoons, and handwritten letters. More importantly, they learned they both carried wounds that had never fully healed. One afternoon, while organizing a storage closet, Rowan accidentally found a faded photograph of Alara as a little girl standing between her parents. She quietly explained that she had been only 9 years old when they died in a highway accident. Since then, her grandmother had become her entire world. Every birthday, every graduation, every success, and every heartbreak had been shared with the woman now growing weaker each day. The fear of losing her wasn't simply about grief. It was about losing the last living connection to the family she once knew. Hearing her story forced Rowan to confront his own memories. For years he had avoided speaking about his late wife because every conversation reopened old pain. But watching Alara fight so hard for the people she loved reminded him that love was never something to hide from, even when it ended in heartbreak. That afternoon, for the first time in 5 years, he spoke honestly about the woman he had lost, admitting how loneliness had quietly shaped every decision since her passing. Alara listened without interrupting, offering no easy answers, only understanding. Somehow that simple act lifted a burden Rowan had carried for far too long. The weeks that followed brought both hope and uncertainty. Although her grandmother's health continued to decline, her final days became filled with laughter instead of fear. Rowan often read aloud from her favorite novels while Alara prepared tea in the kitchen. They shared old stories, looked through family photographs, and filled the house with warmth that illness could not erase. The grandmother watched them carefully, recognizing something they were still too afraid to admit. Before drifting into an afternoon nap one day, she gently told Alara that life had a remarkable way of sending people to us exactly when our hearts were ready to receive them. Not long afterward, her grandmother passed away peacefully with Alara holding one hand and Rowan holding the other. The loss was overwhelming, yet it was softened by the knowledge that she had not been alone. In the difficult days that followed, Rowan stayed close without trying to erase Alara's grief. He helped organize the house, sorted treasured keepsakes, and reminded her that healing never meant forgetting. Little by little, the empty rooms began to feel less painful because they were filled with memories instead of silence. Months later, Alara made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. Rather than selling the family home, she transformed it into a welcoming community reading space where children could borrow books, elderly neighbors could gather for afternoon conversations, and anyone struggling with loneliness could find a warm cup of coffee and a friendly face. Rowan built the shelves by hand, carefully carving small wildflowers into the wood because they reminded him of the garden her grandmother had loved. Standing together on the porch during a bright autumn afternoon, they watched families arrive carrying books, homemade desserts, and hopeful smiles. The little house that had once echoed with fear and uncertainty had become a place where people found comfort and connection. Rowan finally understood that helping Alara had never been about rescuing someone else. It had been about allowing himself to live again. And Alara realized that although grief never completely disappears, it can make room for gratitude, friendship, and eventually love. Neither of them could change the painful chapters that came before, but together they proved that the next chapter could still be beautiful. Sometimes the greatest gift we give another person is simply refusing to walk away when they need someone most. And in doing so, we often discover that our own hearts begin healing too.